Welcome. Happy Friday. It's August. Here we are. Thank you so much for joining the Northwest ACUHO First Friday webinar to discuss student activism on campus. This slide features a variety of illustrations of protesters holding signs. The backgrounds of the slide is gray and the main text is navy blue. The numbers on the slides in the future indicating which sections we are on are orange. My name is Allie Gary. I use she, her pronouns. I am the apartment living manager at Oregon State University, and I'm also the diversity, inclusion, and engagement director for Northwest ACUHO. And then I will turn this over to Swati to introduce herself.
Thanks, Allie. My name is Swati Balaji. I also use she, her pronouns. I am currently a residence life coordinator or a residence director here at Mount Royal University in Calgary, Alberta. I serve as the DEI co-chair for the engagement committee, but also I don't have a chair anymore because they left. So by proxy, I am also the chair of the engagement committee, and I also serve as the DEI co-chair. Very excited to be here. Lovely to meet all of you.
Excellent. Here are a few things that we plan to go over and discuss today. We have a very brief history of student activism in the United States and Canada. We'll talk about some recent trends within student activism on campuses. Spoiler alert, this will be an opportunity for us to have some conversations around it. We're also going to talk about how do we support students while holding them accountable. And finally, we'll talk about what's next. All right, a brief history of student activism in the US and Canada. On this slide, there's a photograph of a feminine Black person speaking into a bullhorn. Their left arm is raised and there are protest signs behind them. So student activism is not new. In fact, student protests such as strikes date back to the early days of universities in the Middle Ages, with some of the earliest being the University of Oxford strike of 1209 and the University of Paris strike of 1229, which lasted 2 years. All right, so now we have a quick timeline. On November 22nd, 1963, University of Toronto students marched on the provincial legislature at Queen's Park to express their concerns about the future of the Canadian Confederation. This was organized in preparation for the Federal Provincial Conference later in that month. Students in Quebec also led their own protests around this. They stated they wanted the things that separated the French from the English, that they should be creative differences of language and culture, not a border between two countries and a record of myopic relations. In March of 1965, students in Toronto sat and protested at the United States Consulate 24 hours a day, braving snow and sub-zero temperatures to demand the recognition of basic democratic rights in the American South. It should be noted that these activists were criticized for ignoring the plight of the First Nations and minorities in Canada while protesting against the racial prejudice in America. In 1968, Columbia University students occupied university buildings to protest segregation and the Vietnam War. They urged the university to cut ties with the Institute for Defense Analysis, which was researching weapons development for the United States government's war effort. New York City police stormed the campus and arrested more than 700 people after a week-long standoff. The black and white photo here shows students seated and standing on the second floor ledge of a building. Faculty and staff stand on the ground wearing white armbands for solidarity. In the 1980s, students all over the country protested the apartheid in South Africa. Their demands of the university administrators were practically identical to what protesters are asking for today. They wanted their universities to divest from firms that supported or profited from South African apartheid, and they were effective. 155 universities ultimately divested. And in 1986, the US government also bowed to the pressure from protesters and enacted a divestment policy. There are other campus protests, including what resulted in the Kent State Massacre, but to ensure that we can cover everything we would like to cover, we're not going to go into detail about that today. In 2011, Occupy Wall Street shifted to college campuses. The most notable was at Berkeley, where about 3,000 people gathered on Sproul Plaza to protest tuition increases, and many then set up a camp. Demonstrators linked arms to protect their tents, but police officers broke through and took down more than a dozen tents and arresting about 40 protesters. On October 13th, 2014, hundreds of protesters, both students and non-students, gathered around a clock tower on St. Louis University's campus in Missouri to protest the police shooting Von Derrick Myers Jr., the 18-year-old son of a university employee. Von Derrick's death occurred just months after the police killing of Michael Brown, an unarmed teenager in nearby Ferguson, Missouri, and it reignited frustrations with the police officers' treatment of racial minorities. As I'm sure many folks are aware, 2024 brought forth the pro-Palestinian protests and encampments across the United States and Canada. Students and community members at a variety of institutions band together to request that colleges disclose how endowment funds are invested and that they divest from weapons manufacturers and other businesses profiting off of the war in Gaza. Again, this is very similar to the asks of students that were protesting the South African apartheid in the 1980s. Okay, some recent trends within student activism on campuses. Oh, it cut off, dang. So we've seen lists of demands. Many protesters have brought forth lists of demands to the university administrators. And we're also seeing a lot of encampments. Some protesters are setting up encampments on college and university campuses. So on this slide, there's two circles that are partially cut off with photos of feminine folks shouting into bullhorns. I have some examples of the institutions that had encampments. This is not a full list, but this is just some. We had Yale, Columbia, NYU, Miami University of Ohio, UNC Charlotte, Harvard, Cal Poly Humboldt, Michigan, University of Houston, Rice, University of Minnesota, University of New Mexico, Pitt, Berkeley, MIT, Rochester, University of Maryland, UT Dallas, Swarthmore, University of South Carolina, Vanderbilt, the New School, Emerson Pomona, Claremont, Stanford, Tufts, Oregon State University, Cornell, Penn State, UVA, Virginia Tech, Princeton, UT Austin, San Francisco State, University of San Francisco, Sacramento State, University of Arizona, and many more. What are some things you all have been seeing on your campuses? Or maybe what are some things that you all have heard have been happening at other campuses nearby if they're not necessarily happening on your campus directly? Anyone?
I guess it's more asked to the graduate students unionized this last year. So it's a little bit different than for an outside cause. But I think that's the first time that I've kind of seen more kind of activism, or it's activism against support for the university from our community. So yeah, it's just an interesting difference in the examples that you're kind of giving. But anyways, yeah, I don't know.
That is not uncommon, Matthew. I think we're seeing more and more groups of students organizing on their campuses, trying to unionize, whether it's graduate students, whether it is undergraduate resident assistants, it's happening in a lot of different places. So thank you for mentioning that. Megan, you had unmuted. I didn't know if you had anything that you wanted to share.
I was just going to, we can elaborate on the Oregon State University encampment. You mentioned that we had one. There's a few of us on the call from Oregon State, and yeah, we did have an encampment on campus. I was trying to look up exactly how long they were set up, and I am unsure of that. Couple weeks at least, I believe. But again, we've been already talking about what those students were generally asking for, and our leadership was very in communication back and forth with the encampment leadership about what they were asking for, which did include things like financial. I don't remember what some task forces about making sure we were not investing or buying from companies and places that were in support.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. In the chat, Sierra mentioned that they moved over to Western Oregon University from UCSB and haven't seen anything here, but at UCSB, they also had encampments and listed demands. Western Oregon University had some smaller scale activism, usually related to wanting to post flags in common spaces. But Sierra hasn't seen a whole lot of that since they started, even though it's summer. So thank you for sharing that as well. Okay. Anyone else have things that they want to add about what they're seeing on their campuses?
I can add a little bit here. I think the institution that I'm at currently, it is a very small school, so not a lot of protests and like encampments here, but I know across Canada, especially like my alumnus, like the school that I went to for my undergrad, like Matthew mentioned, like a lot of graduate students like unionizing, and very recently, I think before the academic year ended in 2024, the unions, the graduate student and like the teaching like assistant faculty were kind of butted heads with the university administration, which led to like a full-blown strike, which meant like classes got suspended, students didn't have like their final grade. They were supposed to end classes in April, but then like dragged out into the middle of May, almost like to like beginning of June. So we've seen like similar to like the list of demands, like encampments, I think there's also this like strong move towards like, we're not going to work unless you pay us. And I think that is kind of the rising tide here in like Canada, because a lot of other institutions have also kind of followed suit, mainly because of union representation and like wanting to be fairly compensated for the work that they're putting in.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for sharing that, Swati. Okay. I'll turn it over to Swati, and then Swati, you just let me know when you want me to click through.
Sounds good. Yeah. So we're just going to shift gears here a little bit and talk about how student activism kind of intersects with conduct. So we do want to support, our students with everything that they want to achieve with universities. Like college is such a fun time of figuring out what you want to do and like where your place is in the world, but also how do we hold them accountable when it comes to things like, maybe destroying things that are not supposed to be destroyed. So if you want to click through, Ellie. So here there's kind of like 4 points that I can talk more about, but just like big concept ideas of how can we balance the student support and kind of hold them accountable for their actions. I think the first and most important would be encouraging this, open dialogue between folks. So kind of facilitating any constructive conversations between students and administration, providing platforms. So within residence and like student affairs, like what is our role in being able to provide these platforms for students to have these voices and ideas and concerns be brought up to administration, hosting educational workshops. I know programming is a very big piece of what we do here in residence and like res ed. So kind of offering training on effective activism and understanding institutional policies. So I think it will be beneficial to kind of break down what the policies are for students so that they can, protect themselves when like protesting for causes that they believe in. I think this could also include sessions on like conflict resolution and ethical conduct so that they can know how they can go about participating in these encampments or protests that happen. I think providing resources and support for them and making sure that it is accessible, so be it counseling, mentorship programs, giving them guidance to like navigate any of the policies and procedures that are in place, I think is very important. And also establishing clear guidelines. It is one thing to say like, hey, this is, there's freedom of speech, voice your opinions and like voice your concerns, but also setting expectations for like behavior during activism, I think is very important, and also kind of outlining the consequences of the violations, so that our goal here is kind of making them aware of everything that exists within their rights as student, so that it is a very transparent manner, so that they can go about doing what they want to do. You want to go to the next slide? What is the impact of activism on campus living? Because a lot of this takes place on campus, and our role in student affairs and like residence life is like we house the students that are there, and like we take care of people here, and if there is like emergency situations that come up, we do offer a place for them, a roof over their head. So I think some of the impacts listed here would be like the safety and well-being, be it of the people participating, the community aspect of it, which is the second point. So kind of addressing any potential safety concerns that arise from activism and implementing measures, I guess, to like ensure the well-being of all students that are present in the community. And I think with the community dynamics, it also helps to kind of foster this community where diverse perspectives are respected. So, this could look like training our student staff to have these difficult conversations with students, training like our front desk, like our housing operations staff, because you don't know when they're going to, like students are going to need that support. So doing our best to kind of be prepared to have that conversation if they come up, I think is a place that, we see the impact of activism, and making sure like our policy, ensuring that the activism kind of aligns with campus policies to prevent any further conflicts, and monitoring and adapting policies as needed, I think is also very big, because in recent times there's a lot more protests, a lot more activism. So I think our role would kind of be to look to the future and like see how we can adapt and mend some of the policies that are in place to make sure that it's serving the needs of our student population. And lastly, I think ensuring that students have their support system in place. So strengthening any support systems for students affected by this activism related conflicts, and providing resources for them to rely on that is not just, like residents, being able to like kind of connect them with campus partners, community partners, and giving them the option to explore those other avenues. Next slide here. So as you can see, it's a picture of a protest here from 2023 that happened in Quebec, and it's a very peaceful protest with a sign that says "Keep education affordable and stop the tuition hikes." This is a very, very big topic of conversation in Canada specifically, because international student tuition is almost like 15 to 20 times what domestic students would be paying. So a lot of that frustration translates over to these protests of like, hey, there has to be legislation in place. And most of the times, these are peaceful protests that are taking place. And with the education hikes that are happening and like funding that's getting cut, students are very clearly frustrated. And with like, that is why we see this uprising and like students forming unions and, going after what they really want. So that's a little bit of the student activism and conduct. We can switch into future issues. So what's next? As you can see, there's a lot here. So kind of the future direction that I think all of us can, discuss in the spaces that we're in would be embracing this evolving forms of activism. So not being very rigid of like, oh, let's just like protest all the time, like recognizing any new and emerging issues, and also kind of adapting to a digital and hybrid form of protest. I think protest is no longer just like, I'm going to sit out in the sun for like 4 days. Yes, that is also kind of protest, but there's also like digital and like hybrid, and there's many, many ways that protest and like activism is taking shape. So ensuring that we're kind of adapting to those models and know how to kind of support students through that. So that leads to my second point, where we need to expand mental health resources for student activists, because it is a tricky part where there's, you have students from both sides. So how do you support someone that's affected, and how do you support someone from the community that is, causing an oppression, for example? And this could also look like providing trainings and workshops and strengthening any support networks of like campus and community partners. The next point would be policy development. I think this is something that all institutions and all, lawmaking bodies across the world kind of have to take a look at, which involves they're inclusive and equitable to all folks, and kind of regularly reviewing and updating these conduct guidelines, be it within residence, within the university or college, and also involving students in this decision-making process. I think a lot of the frustration comes from students feeling like their voice is not heard. So if we're involving them in this decision-making process, we can ensure that, we are being inclusive and equitable when creating policies that affect the students. The next point here is anticipating any challenges and opportunities that might come up. So recognizing potential challenges in managing this activism could give us a better understanding of how to provide the support for the students that are involved, and then identifying any opportunities for growth or positive change and preparing for the evolving dynamics involved in student activism. And then include addressing safety, which is one of the biggest points that everybody should be talking about, which is making sure we're implementing measures to ensure safety of students during the protest and fostering excuse me, an inclusive environment that kind of values diversity and like fosters inclusivity, and then preparing also for potential conflicts that might arise. And the last little bit here is promoting dialogue. So as I mentioned before, how do we bring student voices into these big discussions that are happening? So making sure that we can, if there's opportunities that come up about open forums, that students can talk to administration, or giving them information about any programs that exist where, they can go voice their opinion to, or like university administration directly, I think is a way that we kind of promote that dialogue. And also building a culture of mutual respect and encouraging collaboration between like activist groups and the university department, I would say are few things that we can kind of start thinking about, given the trends that we've observed in the past and happening recently. And the next slide, I have a couple of questions here for us to open it up to the floor, because Ali and I have been talking for like 30 minutes now. So for discussion, we can go through each of the questions. You can also just pick whichever one you want to answer and, share whatever knowledge you have. Which is kind of like the first one I'm generally curious about, because at my previous institution, we did have like a group of students that could talk to university administration one-on-one. But here, I don't think we have anything similar. So how can students be more involved in the policymaking process, be it like within university or within residence? Matthew?
So I'm assuming that all of our institutions have like, I guess, student governance structures at various levels, both within like the residence halls, as well as like the university at the larger. And so I feel like that if those particular like structures and organizations are well supported and working well, and like that are, I know, part of the university decision-making process, and staff administration, and, can use that. I feel like at least for like internal things that can alleviate a lot of the pressure that then turns into activism eventually. When it's other things like totally outside the university's kind of ethos of direct control, I mean, those are good, kind of healthy. I think they can kind of, when you're protesting a larger world kind of thing. I know some campuses have just made it like, if you have a population that tends to be interested in that more public activism, just making like sure students know like that, like, these are some great places, to gather together for these kind of things. Not saying that they have to go there, but that the university is being proactive about that. And that conversation, definitely not saying like you can't do it, but it's just kind of trying to create opportunities where it's going to be successful and it's not going to conflict with other things on campus, operational things. And so So yeah, I just my particular campus, and I don't know like why, maybe it's because it's really cold here when students are going to school, and so doing things outside just isn't as appealing to go sit outside for long periods of time. But we just don't have a lot of that. Those like big, large scale like protests or activism outside, or that's very visual. So I don't know if that's, like I said, environmental, or if it's a product of our internal kind of governance structures, maybe working well to get help students feel heard, because I think that's a lot of times what a protest is doing. And so anyway, I'll stop talking now. Give it up to Deborah.
Matthew, that was very well put. Deborah.
Hi, thank you, Matthew. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of note a couple of things that we've done at so I'm at Oregon State University, and I have been in my current role for about a year and a half, and I've seen some things that have really been proactive that I thought were really interesting to share maybe to this group. I think it's, when Matthew was alluding to the fact that, lots of organizations have student leadership, I think it's important to remember that that student leadership is there for certain roles and can be limited if they're not kind of invited in to other spaces. So I think there can be kind of a view of this is what the student leadership should be involved in, and then they're kind of boxed into that. And some of the things that I've been really impressed with the group that I work with is the amount of times that we've gone out of our way to say, hey, let's go see if somebody who's in the, the student government would like to be on this panel. They could be in an RFP process. They could be, we just did a big, huge voting rights contract, and we invited several of them in, and they got to have a say about what beverages there was going to be on campus. There was a task force created looking at minimum wage for students, and part of them were there for that discussion. So I think there are those, just because you have a student government, there's there takes a leap of faith in the leadership to then say, now that we have those people here that are interested, that are engaged and willing to go out and do focus groups and willing to elicit information, how can we then bring them in and not look at it like a relationship of antagonistic in any way, but actually look at it more like a collaboration. And I think the opportunities when we have brought them in for that type of collaboration has been really wonderful, but not just wonderful, also eye-opening. I think the things that you think they want are maybe not the things that you realize they want. And you get a little bit more of that insider perspective. So I think utilizing your student government is really wonderful. And when you can start to do that in new ways and just continually be thinking, whenever I've got a task force, granted there's, conflict and timing and what you can do with, with their schedules and so forth. But any of those opportunities, I think, has been really wonderful. And I think it has definitely enhanced our ability to be successful.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. Anybody else? Okay, we can move on to the second question, which I think Deborah, you kind of alluded to, with like task forces and like having the student government come in to run focus groups. So what strategies can be used to ensure conduct guidelines are inclusive and equitable?
I mean, I feel like Deb put it very well, of saying like having those task forces and having outside perspectives to like with the policymaking processes. I think that that's helpful with the like conduct guidelines to make sure that they're inclusive and equitable. So it's not just one person deciding it. I mean, at a lot of institutions, it's not just one person. There's a lot of hands in the pot, but it's not necessarily a task force. But having folks that are specifically dedicated to reviewing it and saying like, okay, let's scrutinize this and make sure this is actually inclusive and equitable, and like that is what their task is. I think that that could be really helpful.
Just to that point, if you want to be inclusive and equitable, you have to look at it from every angle every time, right? You can't just say, well, we're hiring people with, DEI experience, or, we've got somebody on here that's doing this or that, and it can't be left in one person. I think if you really want to be equitable and you really want to be inclusive, you need to show that in every aspect of everything that you're doing. And you have to then accept it can be more time consuming and it can be more complicated. But the end result is always better. It's always more successful. But it does take a leap of faith again.
That is a great point. Yeah, I think one thing that at least like this campus we're kind of working with is like having provincial legislation that is, threatening to pull funding from EDI initiatives. So how do you kind of build up a program that just came into existence and is now being kind of held hostage for funding? But I think having that leap of faith and like building that trust and placing that trust in the people to kind of do and like operate in a certain way, I think is a big ask. But yeah, thank you for sharing. What potential challenges do we foresee in managing activism on campus? Sierra?
Can everybody hear me? Wonderful. I think something that I've personally really struggled with is balancing out this idea that specifically protest and a lot of the larger scale things we've been talking about in the session today, like encampments or building sit-ins and things. I feel like some of the intention of that is to be disruptive, which almost always includes a violation of some sort of like policy or some sort of accountability piece on campus, which normally during the course of the academic year makes a lot of sense to hold people accountable for disrupting courses and things. But I think it's been really challenging for me to kind of navigate this idea of understanding that protest is supposed to be disruptive, and that's how we can kind of force, corporations or immoral kind of policies to change when things like some of the activism we've talked about, like including people in policymaking decisions, haven't been successful. And at the same time, having to hold students accountable for the policies that they are protesting against. And I think that's something I've personally found really challenging as someone who, in some ways, agrees with some of the protests that students have engaged in on campus and understands that, yeah, that is needed. And I'm the person having to hold them accountable and potentially add consequences to the type of protest that they've engaged in. So maybe that's more of a personal challenge rather than an institutional one, but it's something I've really struggled with, especially when students come talk to me and they're like, well, how am I supposed to protest then when the things that I've been doing have been unsuccessful? Or how am I supposed to engage in the way that I'm, allowed to when I've been doing that for the last year and that's been unsuccessful? I don't really know an answer, but that's kind of where I'm at.
I think there's an interesting statement in there about what's the next step when you're unsuccessful. And that's a hard thing, right? Because on college campuses, we want to encourage people to speak up. We want to encourage change. We want to encourage, people to have, open minds and be outspoken, and to really speak about really difficult issues. We don't need students to just sit in the corner and do what they're told. And I won't say that all institutions feel that way, but I think the majority of us do, or at least I hope that we do. So I think there's something to be said for when it's not working. But I something that comes to mind, because the protests that we've seen on campus, the ones that Megan was talking to, they were being successful in many fronts, and the university was listening and the university was engaging in conversations. But like Sierra mentioned, there was a certain element of trying to keep it on the forefront of everybody's mind, the pro-Palestinian stuff. And So they kind of were upping their demands for things they knew that the university could not do. And I think there's a balance there. And how long do you let them continue to have that voice, knowing that maybe they're asking you to pick sides when you know it's a complicated issue and you're just trying to support everyone and you just want the war to stop. So I think there's I think there's a certain line where university says they can't, but if I don't know, I think there's a place where you need to support freedom of speech, and allow those things to be what they're going to be, and you hope that you've got a just administration in your university that will act accordingly. I'm grateful for our administration and for our leadership. I think they've acted admirably in trying to maintain people's First Amendment rights. And I think that that's a beautiful thing to see. And that is what what do we say? Lead by example. So.
Thank you for sharing that. I think about some of the things that Swati was saying of like, how can we like be more proactive around like supporting our students around these ideas, because student activism is not new and it's not going anywhere, right? So like, how do we find ways to like help them understand how they can do this like safely and like within whatever like restrictions or policies or guidelines that are set up? And maybe it is about having some sort of like activism like 101, or like opportunities for like students to actually get additional information and like help them understand what their rights are, right? Because sometimes our students don't fully understand like what they are legally allowed to do, like what is well within their rights. And granted, sometimes they want to go beyond that, right? They're like, all right, great, I don't care if this is legal or not. But if we provide the information to let them know, like, this is what you can do within the constraints of the institution, just helping them understand. And then I think Swati, you had also mentioned like helping folks understand what the consequences can be, because like, yes, you can do these things. And if we do need to hold folks accountable, it's important for them to know what that accountability looks like. So I don't know if I necessarily have like an answer like of how to go about that, who should be the folks that are like leading those things. But yeah, another like potential challenge that I was like mulling over is, I don't know about other folks that this is a fairly Oregon State University dominated call right now. But we saw a lot of folks that weren't necessarily students that were part of our encampment. And I feel like that results in potential challenges too, because like we can't necessarily hold those folks accountable in the same way that we can hold our students accountable. There's like legal ramifications and things around that, but like you can't send non-students that are just like community members through our conduct process to help like go through an educational process, right? So like I don't know if other folks were seeing people that were not necessarily part of the campus community being a part of the protests and how that impacted it, but I was just thinking that that is not uncommon.
I think related to that, yes, we did see a lot of, university staff and faculty also involved in the encampment and protests. And, there's like a line of where what you can do within your position and versus your personal time and how you'll be, kind of what consequences come from that. And I think it's hard for supervisors or units to also toe that line, to provide advice that edges on legal advice when, that's not an easy thing to do. I know that expands beyond students at this point, but also student employees in their role as student employees versus students. I think communicating communicating those fine lines is really hard.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And just good discussion all around. That's a great point, Ali. Like, how do you bring like community members that are not, part that don't fall under the content guidelines, and like how do you kind of educate them? So yeah, I think that would be an area for potential challenge. But switching gears with, being mindful of time, what opportunities for growth and positive change do we see in the future of activism?
I mean, students tend to be a lot of the reason why change happens. Like, they have had successful protests and things for many years that result sometimes in the government actually doing things, which is great. I don't know how likely that'll be, like seeing that as a trend moving forward, that the government is going to get on board with student protests, but it is nice to see that like institutions are like, yeah, you know what, we are listening. Like, Deb, you had mentioned like Oregon State, like they did a really great job as an administration, actually like listening to things and trying to work with the student protesters about like what actually is within our realm that we can do and like what is beyond that. So like I do see a lot of positive change that comes from our like students doing these things. I think it's really great. I don't want to see it go anywhere. Like that might be like a hot take, but I do love seeing students be really passionate about things. And I think this generation of students is very passionate in a way that we haven't necessarily seen before. Like it's at like a different level because they have so much access to news and information at all times that it just is, I think it's really pushing them to want to make a change in a way that other generations may not have been as pushed to do it because they weren't exposed to that information at all times at every day, like TikTok, Instagram, like Snapchat. You're getting all of this from all different directions, right?
I'm gonna say something here and hopefully I don't put my foot in my mouth. Being here in the Northwest, I think that we are largely, treat students favorable in protests. That is not the state everywhere. I think it's really important that we acknowledge that there are students under attack in this country that aren't having that same voice. They're not having those same opportunities. And I think organizations like this, anytime that we can speak out about this, anytime that we can bring groups of university administrators together and have an active voice, any opportunity we can do to show what a successful peaceful protest looks like, what it looks like when an administration works with a student protest, any of those examples that we can normalize as a country will help. And I think that it's, I think it's an understatement to say that us at Oregon State are privileged that, what happened with the protests went so well because there was a lot of people with compassion and understanding and really trying to work together. But that is not the case everywhere. And I think that this is the time, if there was ever a time for a university administration to be speaking to other university administrations and saying, here are ways that you can do this. Here are ways that we can move forward. Here are ways that you cannot be quite so antagonistic. I think those are going to be critical. So when you say opportunities for growth, we have to be that opportunity for growth. There are students all, protesting all over the country that are not getting heard, not getting a platform, not making a change, and they're still there. They're still out there doing it. And if we really want students to be able to have that voice, if we want to teach the future generation to speak up and have a voice, then It starts also with us. I know that sounds a little like foo-foo and, and dramatic, but I mean it sincerely. I really do, because I was in a meeting and we were talking about AI, and I heard a university say, "Oh yeah, we don't do that." I'm like, "But you're a university. AI isn't going anywhere. Like, you need to be looking at how best to utilize it or not utilize it. What you can't do is ignore it, because it does exist. And none of us can ignore what's happening. When the students are protesting, they're protesting about something that is real, and it takes all of us. So my hope for the future is that because we have these incredible platforms, that we can all get together from all over the country or all over the world, and we can talk about things and we can share information, that we can also start sharing solutions and opportunities and ways that we can, positively hear people and positively engage people.
I really appreciate you saying all of that. That was very well said. And like pointing out the fact that we are in a very privileged area in the Pacific Northwest, specifically at Oregon State University. Like you said, it's privileged is an understatement. And that we do have to remember that is folks have not always been able to safely protest at other institutions. A lot of these things have ended in violence. We have seen it all over the news. So I agree that it does start with us, and I'm not sure what our university administration is doing here to have these conversations with other institutions, but hopefully they are trying to do that, to utilize their privilege and say, hey, like, here's some things that we've done and here's how it worked and here's how we can continue to make sure that our students are safe. So I just wanted to applaud what you said. That was really, really good. Thank you.
Any other comments, thoughts, feelings, cries of anguish? Yep, I can hand it over to you, Ali. We're almost there.
Alrighty. So the next slide is just a bunch of resources. I highly recommend going on JSTOR. They have a whole student activism section that is free. You don't have to have a JSTOR account. They just have it made free and available to anybody that wants to get information. It has a bunch of like history and like what they suspect could happen in the future and things like that. It's a really great resource. These other resources are about some of the other protests and student activism items that we discussed before. So I think that there's a way that this can be available later. I'm not 100% sure, but if folks want it, I can send it out. If you like put your info in the chat, I can make sure that people get the resources.
Yeah, is it possible to just I guess you don't necessarily have.
We
Yeah.
have your emails because you registered, so we can send.
Okay, yeah, great. That would be wonderful. Thank
That's
you.
it. Thank you, Megan. It's like, yeah, we'll do it this way. No, there's an easier way. Great. So I want to thank you all for being here, for engaging in such a lively discussion around student activism. We mentioned it many a times. It's not going anywhere. In fact, I'm sure that the United States is going to see a lot more with our impending election that is coming up. And I think that it might trickle into our Canadian institutions as well. So we thought it was very important for us to be having these conversations now. And yeah, we really do appreciate everyone taking time out of their Friday to come here and chat about student activism. So thank you so, so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for facilitating.
Thank you.